So the topic today is economic liberalization in China. We're going to talk about economic liberalization in the context of most of the countries that we study this year. It's sort of no more important than it has been in China over the last 40 or 50 years. So first, we're going to talk about what is economic liberalization as a concept, and then we'll talk about how it applies to Chinese history and what we have seen occur in China over the past 50 or 60 years. So first of all, economic liberalization is defined as the lessening of government involvement and restrictions within a country. So what we saw basically in China was this shift from a command economy or an undeveloped economy into a market-oriented economy. So one of the big changes that's happened within Chinese politics and society, kind of since the 1980s, has been the development of a rapidly evolving private economy or market-based economy. Still with some characteristics of socialism that are sort of remnants of the communist system in the 1940s and 50s and 60s. So policies associated with economic liberalization include the reduction of tariffs, which essentially are duties or taxes that are placed upon imports from other countries. The encouragement of foreign direct investment, so direct investment from other countries or businesses in other countries. Investment meant deregulation. So the reduction in government policies or regulations that are kind of targeted at businesses. The privatization of state-owned enterprises. So we've seen kind of a shift in terms of the ownership of companies within China from the government or the state to private entities, and increasingly the involvement in economic supranational organizations or trade agreements. So things like the World Trade Organization, and other regional kind of agreements as part of the Belt and Road Initiative. China has frequently engaged in trade agreements with its neighbors and with other kind of economic powers throughout the world. So think about when this started. So the Chinese economy under Mao Zedong was essentially a very complicated series of developments. But to paint with a really, really broad brush, primarily agrarian or based in agriculture. So there was a strong emphasis on the power of the primary sector and essentially industrialization through agriculture. So I think the way to understand a lot of China's economy in the 1940s and 1950s was trying to replicate the relative success of the Soviet Union in industrialization in the 1920s and 30s. So they essentially developed a lot of 5-year plans, kind of targeted at industrializing segments of the Chinese economy. They emphasized the power of communal farming and the power of the working class. So policies like relocating populations to farms, to work in communes, things like that, were pretty common. And we often under Mao, you saw sort of wild swings of reforms, and then followed by sort of a swing back to more Marxist thinking, and this sort of back and forth between policies that encourage private ownership and policies that discourage private ownership. China during this time was mostly closed to foreign investment and sort of closed off from the rest of the world. So hard to invest money in, hard to engage the government with, not even officially recognized as China by a lot of the world, including the United States, up until the 1970s. So essentially, if you were to kind of paint, again, with a pretty broad brush, highly inefficient central planning. So planning by the government, oftentimes this resulted in lack of economic growth and even more tragically, oftentimes lots of man-made disasters like famines and shortages of really important food and goods, and essentially a lot of chaos and a lot of inefficiency within their economy. So after the death of Mao, you saw a kind of a brief struggle for power, and sort of always within the government, there were more people that were hardcore communists, more people that were essentially reformers or wanted to implement market-based reforms into the system. So Deng Xiaoping was one of the most important people within the Mao era. He was frequently sort of a source of power, but oftentimes also purged and and spent time in prison camps and things like that. So he was a prominent leader, sort of even in the Mao era, and always in sort of the reform-minded camp of implementing market-based reforms into the system. So he gains power in the late 1970s, and you start to see market-based forms almost immediately become implemented into the system. So they sort of start with things like private ownership of farming. So the communal system starts to diminish, and there starts to be more sort of private incentives baked into farming and small business. You see a normalization and an opening up to the rest of the world. So they normalize diplomatic relations with the United States, but also with a lot of other countries. And you start to see a little bit of foreign investment start to trickle into China. And probably most importantly, you have a policy called the Four Modernizations, which is specifically targeting modernization in the fields of agriculture, industry, science, and technology. So I think one thing that is oftentimes lost when you talk about China is a lot of these agricultural reforms were happening all throughout the world at the same time. So things like the Green Revolution took place in countries like India and Mexico, similarly at the same time. So you saw big booms in production and agriculture there. And we see that in China too. And essentially that's what oftentimes allowed China to start to grow as well. Okay, so Deng Xiaoping, important figure in the 1970s, and continuing sort of into the 80s and 90s. So he is in charge until the early 90s, 1993, I think officially. So under Deng and his successors, Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, China continues this sort of trajectory of market-based reforms of the economy, and essentially driving through industrialization in the 1980s and 1990s and early 2000s. So they continue to further relax things like tariffs and barriers to trade with other countries. They create what are called special economic zones along the coast. So these are areas in which essentially goods can come in and not be assessed a tariff or not be assessed duties. So there's kind of in general coastal areas with relaxed regulations and different trade laws. So these were meant to attract foreign direct investment from other countries, and meant to sort of build up specific areas of the country that were associated with specific fields. So kind of technological boom areas and manufacturing areas. These were pretty successful, and many of these areas sort of transformed into a lot of the core economic zones that exist within China today, kind of the eastern economic core of China. Kind of alongside these economic reforms, you also saw some political reforms. So the political system becomes sort of far less doctrinist in its thinking. So you start to see capitalists and people who are not communists ideologically allowed into the Chinese Communist Party. So essentially, you see the CCP transform from, something that is ideologically communist to something that is more best understood as sort of an authoritarian one-party state that incorporates a lot of different ideologies into its governance. So equivalent to something like the PRI in Mexico for most of the 20th century, which we'll talk about, or other sort of authoritarian one-party states that sort of seek to include lots of different ideological views. And you also have, as this is its own. You could take an entire college class on rural to urban migration in China in this time period. But you have kind of the most massive migration, I think, in human history in terms of numbers, but kind of massive migration from rural areas in China to urban areas under the hukou system, so the management system of allowing people to migrate within the country that China has. So you have widespread migration from rural to urban areas, essentially, that coincides with industrialization. So as you can see from this chart, China's economy has skyrocketed, or as I wrote here, skyrocketed, to the number 2 economy in the world. So just in the past 25 years, from an economy that, in terms of its GDP, was under $1 trillion to where it is today, which is $13.6 trillion as of 2018. So it's surpassed a lot of other countries. It is firmly number 2 in the world behind the United States, and kind of at the current trajectory is expected to pass the United States at some point in the middle of the 21st century. in terms of total GDP, just kind of out of sheer demographics and numbers. So kind of leading into more recent years under Xi Jinping, there's been continued private ownership of large companies. So one thing that you've seen that's been interesting is some of the most kind of richest people in the world now are owners of Chinese companies. And oftentimes these people are kind of important figures, not just economically, but also politically speaking. So for instance, Jack Ma is a member of the CCP, and other kind of important Chinese business leaders are all kind of ingrained into the CCP as leaders. So I think in order, kind of what's important to understand here is if you want to become a business leader in China, you have to play ball and sort of have good relations with the CCP. They've allowed and encouraged foreign companies to operate within China. So kind of continuing that, you've seen, I think recently China made it legal for kind of further loosened restrictions on foreign companies to operate or to own things within China. So previously, a lot of these opportunities had been closed off to foreign companies. And kind of most importantly, or most recently, you've had the creation of what's called the Belt and Road Initiative. So this is a huge investment by China to essentially connect their infrastructure with other infrastructure that exists within Central Asia. So to try to normalize or improve trade relations with these countries, and to build their infrastructure to connect with Central Asia and then ultimately with Eastern Europe and with European markets. So this is a kind of a long-term plan to improve and modernize and connect China with the rest of the world in terms of their high-speed rail system, their infrastructure, and their economies. And kind of one of the hopes of this, I think, is that essentially this will kind of, through their connection, also help to develop many of the western parts of China that are rural and much less developed. All right, so China is seen by many as sort of one of the great successes in terms of economics over the past 50 or 60 years. I do think China faces a number of problems going forward. Kind of the first one I mentioned is demographic problems that are created by the one-child policy. So we haven't talked a lot about the one-child policy yet in class, but essentially what it is facing in some ways is kind of a working class that's shrinking as a percentage of the population. So in order for China to sort of maintain current levels of economic growth, you would expect they would need to loosen immigration policies or encourage immigration, or you might see kind of economic growth rates stall or continue to slow, which they've been doing, and which is sort of a natural occurrence after industrialization. Once countries sort of grow fast or grow quickly during industrialization, it's super natural for it to slow down and for it to become more kind of constant. I think China's leveled off at around 6 or 7% a year. So other challenges, economic conflict with foreign countries. So recently, the trade war with the United States in the Trump presidency, other disputes with the United States that sort of extend beyond the Trump presidency, things like currency policies and intellectual property. All of these are big issues with really big economic implications on who invests in China and what they invest and things like that. And then on a smaller scale, China has lots of conflicts with neighbors over things like fishing and other things that are rooted in economic kind of opportunities. It continues to be more difficult for foreign companies to operate within China than in other countries. Oftentimes, you can't run afoul of the CCP. There might be still in lots of parts of the country difficulties operating on a local system. And I think the last big problem, and to me this is maybe the most important one, is economic inequality that exists within China. You have all of the positives that are caused by globalization and free trade, but you also have some of the negatives where a lot of the successes are not felt evenly throughout the country. So you've had a general lack of development in rural China compared to urban kind of core areas. And like many other countries, economic inequality within China is a huge issue and a huge potential kind of problem with legitimacy for China. All right, thanks. Bye.